Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a round 3 game from the 2016 Bilbao Masters Final between Magnus Carlsen, playing on the white end, and Sergey Karjakin. This game will act as a nice preview for their upcoming battle later this year, November of 2016, where they will compete in the World Chess Championship match in New York. Reigning champion Carlsen versus challenger Karjakin. So let's see how their game here in July play out. Carlsen opening with e4, Karjakin replying with the Sicilian, knight f3, d6. We don't go straight in for an open Sicilian. Carlsen elects to build up that advance, c3, preparing to meet c takes d with c takes d and forming an ideal pawn center. Knight f6. e4 is not a threat. This is indirectly defended. Queen a4 would hit with check and pick up the knight. This idea is present for many moves. Bishop e2, g6, castles, bishop g7. White wants to play d4, however playing d4 would allow black to capture e4 now. Notice, queen a4 would no longer be hitting e4 directly. The d-pawn gets in the way. So it's first bishop b5, knight c6, and now d4 can be played with a different idea in mind. There's now a different reason why e4 is poison, because white would take advantage of the pin. On a6, bishop d3, both knights are hit, and one of them will soon be won. So, queen b6 hits the bishop, and more importantly puts pressure on d4. This is important, because white has an ideal pawn center, and allowing them to sit here, controlling all 4 of these squares in the black position, is too much. Black wants some squares to work with. Black wants one of these pawns to move, to flinch. Bishop a4, c takes d, c takes d, and now black gets out of the pin. This is now a threat, so we obviously just develop and defend the pawn, right? Hang on. It's important not to do this. It's important to recognize that black actually has a 2 birds for 1 stone tactic up their sleeve. What am I talking about? This bishop is ready to take out 2 key defenders of d4 if you're not careful. Knight c3, bishop g4. Bishop takes knight, queen takes knight. There's no longer 2 defenders for d4. This is going to collapse. There's a big problem, a big accident is soon to happen on d4 if you're allowing bishop g4 on this move 10. d4 cannot be maintained. White pushes, and the knight, he goes back home. Not the happiest piece in the world, but at least black was successful with making the white center flinch. 2 squares that are now available to the black pieces, c5 and e5. Knight c3 only now. White is working with some space. A good idea is to look for some piece exchanges. That's what we have. Bishop g4, he's given a kick. Bishop takes knight, queen takes. A couple minor pieces have been exchanged. Black has a little bit more, working with the space disadvantage. We'll find it a little bit easier to operate on the squares within the black position now. Knight gets in the ball game. White wants to finish queenside development. Can't move the bishop just yet, though. Needs some defense of b2. Rook a to b1. Well, that's the only rook that could go there, right? The rook for the moment defends b2, just to free up that bishop. Notice, if you're trying to do this to mask the queen from seeing b2, well, this isn't a stable square for the bishop. So it's rook to b1, rook f to c8, have a completely open file. Bishop c2 gets out of any knight c5 move with tempo, and also watches over a sensitive point in the white position, d3. Knight e5, queen e2. Black is repositioning some, opening up the bishop's eyes a little bit more. Bishop g5 throws a punch. That bishop is kicked away some. h6. g5. There's now no more pressure on e7, but there are now some gaps in the black position. h5, f5 is a little bit more vulnerable now. Pawn on g5, not quite a hole, but a little bit more vulnerable. Queen a6, very important moment, and we're nearly at the halfway point in the game. Move 19. Queen exchange, what do we do? Of course, we take the queens, right? We get to double our opponent's pawns. Double isolated pawns, awful, right? Hang on, it's not a good idea to exchange queens. Notice that black will have a lot of pressure on the queen side, especially combined with this bishop cutting right into these dark squares. This is not a good decision because of those reasons, because black would have that queenside pressure, and maybe more importantly, and the other factor to look at, is that with these advances here, it is black who we can say has a little bit more of a vulnerable king position. So it makes sense to keep the queens on the board. Queen d1. Rook c4. Not the only move here. Very logical looking move to, post up that rook right in the white position and prepare to get that last piece involved. Another move, and maybe a better move, is one that looks to restrict one of white's ideas, namely an f4 pawn break. Now that this g-pawn is on the 5th rank, this is a way to crack open the kingside and try to take advantage of these weaknesses that have been created on the black kingside with h6 and g5. h5, f5 a little bit more vulnerable. Breaking open the position with f4 is a way to kind of sneak into those weak points within the black camp. By playing rook to c4, it prepares the doubling on the c-file, but at the same time places a certain restriction on the black pieces. Both knights, in fact, really can't move, as otherwise we can have a case where the bishop takes the knight isn't there to recapture. What are we having? Bishop d3 with the skewer. This knight goes somewhere. We have bishop d3 with the skewer. So this is maybe not a direction to go in for black, pivoting up on c4. Another move, another idea here, is to take into account this f4 pawn break and play knight to g6. This stays out of the bishop. Well, it gets out of the bishop's way. He can now see directly. And more importantly, it looks to control the f4 break. If white really wants to crack with f4, you have to invest the dark square bishop, and I'm not so sure how good an idea this would really be. I would prefer black here, and if white is not fast enough, we could soon see white under some serious pressure along the g-file. And this bishop here, if you consider him worth 3 points, you need to reconsider. He is a beast. Strong, strong, strong piece. Okay, knight g6 is an alternative to combat the f4 pawn break. We didn't have that in the game. Rook c4 instead. King h1, preparing f4. This struck me as a little bit odd. This is, when I'm going through these games, I question move order. In this position, why not just play f4 straight away? What's the big idea here? Does it really matter? Should we put our king in the corner first and then play f4 or f4 straight away? Or does it really matter? Well, it really matters. There are some details here. Should you go straight in for f4 with your king still on g1? Notice there is a move. I'm not saying it's the best move in the world, but notice the different idea that is, or different move that is available for black. Rook d4. How great of an inconvenience is this really? I'm not so sure, but it's an additional idea that black has. Notice the rook cannot be captured because knight f3 is hitting with check. And there goes the queen. So king h1, we can say, doesn't allow for rook to h4 to rattle the queen position. King h1. After king to h1, we have black doubling, white swinging the back completely around, king h1, follow-up move. Sure enough, f4. G takes f, bishop takes f. Let's consider that wasn't just any pawn exchange. That was the heart of the black kingside structure that was just exchanged for the white f-pawn. Who has the safer king? It's white. G2, h3 structure versus h6, f7 structure. Not the happiest structure here for black. Can white really take advantage of this? Queen b6, queen h5, a very active move. Knight f6, queen f5, staying active on this f5 post. She cannot be kicked from that square so easily. Queen to d8, bishop b3, kicks the rook around a little bit, gets out of the line of fire. How reliable a home can c2 really be? Right, the knight was pinned to the bishop for as long as we had that post. Rook to d4, bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and now we have rook b to d1. This is black's best piece. I believe white wants to keep it under control. I'm not so sure white wants to capture the rook, but keeping it under control, maybe there's an idea to get into the second rank, or maybe even some idea of making use of the third rank just for a moment in order to make some kind of transfer over towards the kingside. That might be a very good defensive piece for black. What follows? Queen d7, offering a queen exchange. This is declined. White wants to keep queens on the board. Better king position. Rook to b4. I think there's an alternative here. I'm not really a fan of rook to b4. I think that this is black's best piece, and he does well. I think the rook does well to simply sit there. Even in some case where, let's say, the rook is captured, let me just kind of make a passing move. Let's just assume that this pawn is captured, or the rook is captured, and then this knight is hunted down. We have a case of opposite color bishops, and also, without this pawn on this square, at some point, maybe the bishop can find an excellent post on e5. I think the rook should sit, is the short story, instead of playing over to b4. As it played out in the game, the rook turned out to be a little bit offside from the b4 square. That's what was played. I just kind of made a passing move. What would have been better, one of the better moves here, is to get on with a5. I just made a dummy move here with a6, but something far more meaningful here is a5. Now, what's the meaning behind that? Well, notice the security, the comfort that the white pieces have, the white minor pieces have on b3 and c3. If there isn't a good way to improve the quality of your own pieces, an idea is to try and diminish the quality of your opponent's pieces. a5 is a step in that direction, looking to rattle the bishop's position with a4, maybe even b5, b4. This is an idea black should have implemented to get the queenside pawns rolling in order to disrupt the white minor pieces. In the game, it was rook to b4. Rook to d2 is actually a very aggressive move. Maybe difficult to see that it's aggressive. He's just coming up a single rank, but there's a strong idea in mind with this move. Rook to f8 is kind of crawling up into a ball. This is freeing up the knight to move. Right? He couldn't move for some time because of the pressure on the f-file. Another try is to once again look for these a5 a4 ideas to disrupt the minor pieces. After rook to f8, we now have g4, and these ideas of pushing the pawns is maybe a thing of the past. g4 first. It may be, this rook to d2 move, one may think you're preparing to triple up on the f-file, but not so fast. I like this next move, g4. White is looking to dislodge the knight, and also maybe make use of the g-file. It could be the f-file, it could be the g-file. Playing g4 first keeps those options open for the rook. Notice the importance of the move order here. White isn't going straight in with rook to f2. First g4. On the cards is h4, g5. a5 now, but by this point, it's too late. Rook g2, can be played already, and if a4 is played at this stage, you could actually ignore that as white, playing g5. H takes g, rook takes. Take the bishop, doubled up, soon to be tripled up, soon to be checkmate. You're not defending this attack. So this is coming a bit too late. After rook g2, knight h7, here come the pawns. White is looking to crack open the black king position, get these pieces working at a maximum. Rook b6, here comes g5. King gets out of the g-file. Very sensible. Now doubling on the g-file. f5. A better attempt is rook to g6, but even so, there are ideas here for white to even come over to the h-file. The computer is pointing out bishop h4 first, I guess to inconvenience the queen, and then even operate along the h-file. If there's some capture, let's say at this point after rook to h2, if takes, this is just playing into white's hands. This rook is not playing. This bishop is not playing. It's hard to say that the knight or even the rook is really playing. White is the one who has all the aggressive pieces, and black is just crawling up into a ball at this point. There really isn't a good defense. This would offer some better defense, but even so, it would be a very, very difficult road ahead. After the game move f5, we had queen h3. This pawn is now pinned, and soon we're going to have the g-file ripped right open. Rook to b4, g takes h, bishop takes h. If you're trying to keep this file closed, after queen h3, suppose h5, we can have the rook coming over to f1, and soon this pawn could even be picked up with the bishop. Not a good way to resist this attack either. In the game, the g-file gets ripped open, and these heavy pieces are very telling. There's already a mate threat on g8. Queen takes, rook takes for mate. Knight f6, queen g6 hits the bishop, and knight to g4 is there to defend the bishop, but he could just be picked up. Rook takes knight, and with that, black resigned. What would follow after pawn takes is queen takes bishop, a check, another check, and rook takes pawn. If you don't take the rook here, you're getting mated, and if you do, well, you're not going to be surviving very long anyhow. There isn't really any other move at this point here instead of the game move knight g4. On knight to g8, there's queen h5, and soon we're going to be undermining the black position, taking out the knight, and then taking the bishop. Queen d6, there's now rook g6. There's just no saving at this point. It's beyond busted here for black. So, interesting game. It's nice to see these guys go at it. They'll be at it again once more in this Bilbao Masters Final, and fast forward 4 months, they'll be competing in the World Chess Championship match. Just to the upper right, feel free to cast your vote. Who will you, well, not your vote, but yeah, your vote, I could say it like that. Who will you be rooting for in the World Chess Championship match. Who would you like to see win? Feel free to cast your vote, and maybe even check back from time to time to see what how others are viewing this upcoming match. So, as usual, feel free to comment. Again, cast your vote. Who will you be rooting for? Feel free to leave any comments in the comment section below, and as usual, I hope you got something out of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.